Hello and welcome to another live Sunbelt chat session. And I'm your host, Diana Lindsay. I'm president of Sunbelt Publications. And I thought it might be fun today to talk about heat. Why? Well, we're undergoing this heat spell here, and as many of you know, we are having temperatures that kind of rival our desert areas in San Diego County. We're seeing temperatures in the hundreds on our coast and our inland areas, again, matching our desert areas. And so it just occurred to me, how is it that these plants and animals and all of us are able to survive heat? The interesting thing about it is that you can use a word called sear to kind of take a look at it. And sear is a Navy term. Lowell and I wrote the guidebook for Anza-Borrego Desert region over 40 years ago. And he was in the Navy at that time, ahead of the Navy Survival School up at Warner Springs. And SEER was the unit: survival, evade, resist, escape. That's what they taught the POWs if it captured how to deal with the situation. And surprisingly, those same words can be used to deal with heat and how plants and animals in the desert actually survive. So let's kind of take a look at some of those words and how they apply to the plants out in our desert areas, and in fact areas here too. So if we look at escape, there are plants that actually just totally escape from the desert heat, and those are called annuals. So the annuals only come out when the conditions are perfect and that they can go to flower and they can go to seed, or actually they will just wait for years to come out. That's when we have these great wildflower seasons out in the desert. So those are the ones that actually escape. The real heroes of the desert are the perennials, because the perennials have to deal with the heat. And by the way, these desert plants that do survive out there are called xerophytes. And these are plants that have the ability to withstand a lot of water loss within their systems. To give you an example, if we lost 2 or 3% of the water in our bodies, we would be dead. House plants are not much better, but if we look at the desert plants, a typical desert plant can lose up to 40% of the water within its system. And there's even one plant out there called a creosote, which can lose up to 70% of the water in its system. So that's one of the ways that the desert plants are able to survive, is that they have this ability to withstand a lot of water loss. But let's look at another term. Let's look at the word escape, or actually evade. Let's look at the word evade. Some plants actually were out in the desert areas before it was a desert, before the desert evolved, such as palm trees, the California fan palms. As it became hotter in the desert area, they retreated to areas in the canyons, the west side canyons, where there was water. And so they were able to survive, and they survive today because they have a short root system and their roots must sit in water. So where you find palm trees, water is close to the surface, and they need that, because if you ever looked at a fan palm, they have these giant leaves and they basically just throw out water into the sky because of the evaporation rate on these giant leaves. And so they're drinking up water and then the high rate of evaporation. So that's how they're able to deal with the heat, by sitting in water. There are other plants then that resist the heat, and they have all kinds of techniques to dealing with heat. For instance, there are some plants that have very small leaf surfaces, and they're very tiny, and that way there's not much of a surface area that is exposed to the sun. Or they might have a very thick leaf surface that actually protects the moisture within the leaf. Then there are other plants that might have an angle to the sun, so instead of being flat with the sun actually hitting the leaf surface, they'll be at an angle so that only the tip of the leaves will actually be exposed to the sun. So there's less leaf surface that is hitting the sun. Some plants have a kind of a hairy leaf surface, which is like little umbrellas or that provide shade. So that also then helps protect the moisture within those leaves. And there's still other plants that might have, might actually shut down over part of the desert season, and they become dormant. And these is like Encilia. Encilia might just cut off the moisture to part of the plant, die off part of the plant, but the rest of it then can pop back next spring. So they can also change the color of the leaves. And Encilia, again, starts out green in spring so it can grow fast, and then as it becomes drier, the leaf becomes grayer. So it's more of a whitish leaf, so it reflects less sun, and then it develops a hairy leaf surface to provide shade, and then finally will go dormant. Then there's still other plants that have a long root system, such as the mesquite, which will tap down to a permanent source of water, and they don't really care then how hot it gets because they're constantly drinking water from a permanent source of water deep in the Earth's surface. So that's kind of how the plants deal with it. And then the question is, well, how do the Indians deal with this heat? We're dealing with heat now. We can escape into our air conditioning. We can, you know, provide cover or shade with hats, protect our eyes with sunglasses. So the question is, what did the Indians do? Well, they did the same kind of thing. They retreated into the canyons, into the palm oases, stayed by water, stayed inactive during the heat of the day, like a lot of the animals would, and then came out in early mornings or in late evenings to do what they needed to do to collect things to eat and to survive. But I'd like to kind of spend a few minutes talking about some particular plants and how the Indians actually use them. And speaking about how the Indians use them, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this Sunbelt book, but we have a book called The Coloring of Plants, How Indians Use the Desert Plants. And it has full information on how each of the Indian bands, the Cahuilla and the Kumeyaay, least in San Diego County, and other desert Indians and other bands used the typical plants which were important to them. So in our desert areas, there were two main plants that were very, very important. And they were important because the foods that could be collected from these two plants could be stored and saved for famine years or years when there wasn't much food to collect, and then they could then rely on stored food products. And they can also use this as a trade item. So those two plants in our desert areas was the honey mesquite or screwbean mesquite. And so we have this one, and then we also have the a desert agave. So these are two plants that I'm going to say a few words about, just so you can have an idea of how important these plants were to the desert Indians. So let's start with the mesquite. Now the mesquite was one of those plants that has a deep root system, so it had a permanent source of water. And actually the pods that are on there could be collected in summer, where most plants would be kind of dormant or dried out in the summer. This is one plant that actually in spring starts to flower, and then the pods come out and then they're dry and they can be collected and saved. Every part of the blossom could be used. The blossom could be put into water for a drink. The blossoms could be taken and squished down into a ball and eaten. The green pods could be eaten, or the dried pods could be collected, stored for an incredible long time, or they could be ground and made into a flour so that they consume it and eat it. The wood of the plant was very important because it could be used to make bowls. The branches could be used to make arrow shafts that were important. They could make tools out of the wood. So those were very important. The roots could be used and developed into a chemical that could be used for an insecticide or a wound wash that would heal if you were hurt. So it had that. The fiber from the bark could be actually used to make skirts, so that you had skirting that could be made from it. You could have nets that could be made from it. So there were a lot of different kinds of uses of the mesquite plant in addition to food. So it was a medicine plant, it was a food plant, it was a plant also that the hunters would be nearby and could set up traps because of the seed pots. A lot of the desert animals would be up there trying to eat some of those seeds, and you could set traps around there and you could collect animals that could be eaten also. So that was important to the hunters. Another desert plant that we mentioned was the agave, and the agave was an incredibly important plant because not only was it a food plant, it was also a medicine plant, and it had every part of the agave could be used, and it was a fiber plant that could be used to make netting, to make sandals, to make cradle boards for babies. It could even be used for making diapers for small babies. So a lot of incredible uses for that. But this is an important plant for another reason too. It's the only plant that men harvested. Women typically did the collecting, men did the hunting. But the agave, with its strong leaves and its pointed ends on it, and it's very sturdy, the men actually had to use digging sticks, and digging sticks could be made out of the wood from the mesquite, by the way, and they would have to dig this plant out, and then they would create a pit, line it with rocks, and then put in the stalks in there and roast them. And then 4 days or so later, they would come up, dig this up, and they would have roasted agave that they could eat, or they could dry it out and then save it for years, literally. And this is kind of like fruit, if you get fruit leather and you can save that, well, you could do the same thing with agave. So the agave blossoms could be eaten, the seeds could be ground down and eaten, the stalk could be roasted and then saved for later times. There's also a chemical within the plant that could be used for a wash for healing. You have the fiber, which, so much you can do with the fiber, the carrying nets, the rope that you needed. So that was made from the agave. You can make a tea from the plant too, which would be used for medicinal purposes. And a thing I didn't mention about the mesquite, which is interesting, there's also a gum on that tree, and that gum is a glue, and that glue could be used for attaching arrowheads onto the shafts, which are made from the branches of the mesquite. So you can see in these two plants, extremely important. You can make shelter, use them for shelter. You can use them for medicinal purposes. You can use them as a food. So lots of different things. They both have thorns, and the thorns could also be used for tattooing. In the case of the agave, on that tip of the thorn, you had strings hanging down on it. So you actually have like a needle and a thread or an owl that you could be using for making baskets. So a lot of different kinds of uses out of those plants. So those are just kind of a brief review of two plants that can be used in the desert, two plants that survive desert heat, that have adapted through being able to resist the heat that's there, and important plants that were used by desert Indians. So I hope you enjoyed this chat session, just kind of a brief overview of two plants. And if you're interested, grab this book, find out a little bit more about desert plants. And then this is part of a series too that we have, because you can also find more about lizards and snakes and birds and chaparral, even butterflies. We got a new one coming out of butterflies. So check out our website if you want to learn more about these plants. And then even if you want to be able to kind of color some of these plants and learn more about them, and then there's photographs of all of these plants that you can see. So enjoy your day, stay out of the heat, stay cool, and do those things to avoid the heat, escape that heat, and be a good survivalist. See you later for another chat session.